Today's ceremony, however, has very special meaning. Because today, we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another, or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
On January 20th, 2017, Donald J. Trump was inaugurated as the 45th President of the United States of America. His presidency was the culmination of decades of planning and work, not only by himself, but by elements of the United States Special Operations Command, members of the intelligence community, and the tip of the 21st century warfare spear, Alex Jones's InfoWars, and other information networks with common goals.
This sounds like political presidential talk to me, and I know people have talked to you about whether or not you want to run. Would you ever?
I would never want to rule it out totally, because I really am tired of seeing what's happening with this country.
Trump was saying, who do we get to do this? So there's a real war going on in the elite right now. Don't think Trump just did this on his own. He was recruited by patriots and U.S. intelligence agencies, for a fact. Trump was recruited by the U.S. Army. That's a big secret, but you deserve to know what the Democrats already know.
What we were told by some, such as Alex Jones, is that senior military leaders were considering martial law as the only option to save the country, but they found a willing representative to be the Democratic face of their necessary actions to save the Republic, so they wouldn't have to cross the Rubicon. That person being Donald Trump. Alex Jones has stated this, as well as others in his ecosystem of intelligence and military associations. The information operation of the group behind Trump appears to be the same group behind InfoWars, and would likely have endorsed Alex Jones's meetings with Aleksandr Dugin in an effort to help build a U.S.-Russia alliance. Steve Bannon and Steve Pachenik, both Alex Jones associates, supported this Russian alliance idea. One of the cruxes of the public-facing argument behind this faction as the reason to back Trump is he is fighting the globalists, the Anglo-American establishment, the CFR, the Bilderbergs, or the Satanists that are behind these groups, which are bent on enslaving or exterminating the common person. Both Dugin and Alex have identified the globalists, the Anglo-American establishment, and the Bilderbergs as the common enemy, and we will show a clip here shortly of Alex stating this. However, it first must be noted that some of the evidence Alex uses to justify his position is that the Anglo-American establishment funded and placed the communists in power in Russia, yet, from what we have seen, he ignores the evidence of German involvement. It seems like Alex's claim traces back to the work of Anthony Sutton and perhaps the John Birch Society. Communist researcher and defector interviewer J.R. Nyquist has commented on Sutton's argument, stating, quote, "Many of Sutton's facts are simply a misreading of purposes and motivations. He has left out half the story, the part where all the capitalists who invested in the USSR during the 1920s lost money, or the part where everyone erroneously thought that the USSR would not survive. And then there is the part where Stalin refused to accommodate them in 1939. The capitalists were all betting against the Bolsheviks' regime's survival, while the regime manipulated them to assure its survival." Nyquist then goes on to classify Sutton's work as a scholarly version of the John Birch conspiracy theory of communism. To elaborate on what Alex fails to point out, or perhaps he is purposely misleading his audience by placing the blame of Russian communism on the Anglo-American establishment, we quote from interviewer of the CIA's Cold War Counterintelligence Department employees and author Edward J. Epstein's book, Deception. Epstein says on page 100 that, quote, "In April 1917, with 10 million Russian soldiers still arrayed on the Eastern Front against Germany, the German deception staff organized one of the most successful pieces of planned subversions in modern history. General Walter Nicolai, of the German military intelligence arranged a special train to take Lenin and 30 other revolutionaries from Switzerland, where they had been in exile, to the Russian border, where they would be smuggled in. As he made clear to his superiors, the purpose of this exercise was to undermine the Russian war effort against Germany. His intelligence service, which had been in close contact with the revolutionaries in Switzerland, had correctly assessed that while they were only a tiny faction in Russian politics, they would work conspiratorially to disrupt the new provincial government. And indeed, within a year after it had been insinuated into Russia by German intelligence, the Lenin faction managed to seize power in a coup d'etat. It then moved to withdraw Russia from the war with Germany. End quote. Lenin, in turn, would go on secretly to help the Germans rearm and train its officers in such places like secret bases in Ukraine, starting in 1921 through 1933. That relationship proved invaluable to Germany's plans for reconquest of Europe during World War II.
The euro, which was actually a Nazi German plan to take over countries economically. No, that's on record. And I've interviewed members of the EU Parliament on the subject who were out there at the event.
But what's that?
3,000 people. They turned 1,000. Bilderberg is heavily involved in the EU plan and helped hatch it, and it is a Nazi plan.
Alex has previously stated there are two major factions vying for power. One group that wanted to, quote, totally sell us out to the communist Chinese, end quote, and the other group that, quote, isn't out to rape America completely, end quote. Apparently, the latter group contains people like Dugin and Putin, elements of United States Special Operations Command, the DIA, CIA, FBI, and other intelligence community members retired and active. The former faction, like this latter faction, is also represented by those same U.S. military and intelligence groups, hence why Alex said we are in a civil war in part 1 of our series.
Doesn't mean the whole thing's good. There's a civil war in America right now. One group wanted to totally sell us out the communist Chinese. That's coming up in the next segment. The other group isn't out to rape America completely.
And so I'm just revealing to you here on air that I was recruited by patriot elements inside the shadow government to take on a communist Chinese funding operation. It's not right.
We already documented the evidence in prior sections of our series where InfoWars and members of the military and intelligence community seem to be reading from the same script as factions in Russia, such as that faction which Dugin represents. Quoting from Dugin's 1997 Foundations of Geopolitics, page 118, Dugin identifies the mondialist, which means globalist, and we will use that term instead for simplicity, or Anglo-American order as, quote, the Council on Foreign Relations. It was founded by Morgan, a major American banker. This informal organization engaged in formulating the American strategy on a planetary scale, with the ultimate goal being the complete unification of the planet and the creation of a world government. It was founded in 1921 as an offshoot of the Carnegie Endowment for Universal Peace, and all high-ranking politicians who belonged to it were initiated into the globalist vision of the future of the planet. Since most members of the CFR were at the same time high dignitaries of Scottish Freemasonry, it can be assumed that their geopolitical projects also had some humanistic mystical dimension, end quote. Dugin then goes on to name a second globalist structure that was created in 1954 called the Bilderberg Club, or Group, which brought in Europeans, not just Americans. And the American contingent of Bilderberg, according to Dugin, was represented solely by members of the CFR. The third globalist group was created in 1973 called the Trilateral Commission, of which Brzezinski was the primary organizer. This commission was composed on the American side by the CFR and the Bilderberg elements and had two headquarters, one in Europe and one in Japan. Dugin named David Rockefeller as the head of this group, in addition to Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. The goal of these groups, according to Dugin, was a single world system under the strategic dominance of the West, which put forth progressive, humanist, and democratic values. Interestingly, it was former KGB director Yevgeny Primakov who was part of the Soviet group that received Rockefeller and Kissinger of the Trilaterals in a 1989 meeting in Moscow. Primakov was credited for creating multipolarity, according to Russia Beyond, that is the same Russian-owned news organization Major General Vallely and Michael Maloof appeared on together after Trump was elected, saying Trump wouldn't take a confrontational approach to Russia. Dugin mentions Primakov on page 89 of his book, The Last War of the World Island, as a, quote, moderate patriot, cautious Eurasian, and someone trying to defend Russia's national interest within the limits of what was possible under the conditions of the unipolar world, and also preserving ties with traditional allies. Primakov's wife was the sister of German Mikhailovich Visciani. The Club of Rome, founded by Italian industrialist Aurelio Peccei and Scottish scientist Aleksandr King, established the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, as well as a branch in Moscow called the Institute of Systems Research under Visciani. Dugin points out on page 688 of his Foundations of Geopolitics that the Club of Rome was created in 1967 as part of the Globalist Project. The Club of Rome was working towards a convergence of capitalist and socialist systems merging into a world economic system with common leadership. The Soviet Union, according to Dugin, took a keen interest in these projects and delegated Visciani to the Club of Rome as a member. Dugin considered Visciani as a center for the globalist and the Western unelected elite of the trilaterals working to bring about perestroika in China and Soviet Russia. Dugin said, quote, "The point of globalism is to postulate the inevitability of a full planetary integration, the transition from a plurality of states, peoples, nations, and cultures to a unified one world," end quote. While Dugin appears to be against the forces seeking a one-world government, he seems to suggest something similar to it on page 238 to 239 of his Foundations of Geopolitics, where he discusses a Eurasian planetary empire project. Quote, "At the global level, the construction of a planetary new empire will have as its main scapegoat the United States, the undermining of whose power, up to the complete destruction of this geopolitical structure, will be carried out systematically and uncompromisingly by all participants in the new empire. In this respect, the Eurasian project implies Eurasian expansion into South and Central America in order to take it out of the control of the North. Here, the Spanish factor could be used as a traditional alternative to the Anglo-Saxon one, as well as provoking all kinds of instability and separatism within the U.S. borders, possibly to rely on political forces of African American racists. The ancient Roman formula, 'Carthage must be destroyed,' will become the absolute slogan of the Eurasian Empire, as it will encapsulate the essence of the entire geopolitical planetary strategy of the continent awakening to its mission. Specifics in determining the status of this or that people, this or that country, this or that empire of greater spaces within a common continental bloc will become relevant only after geopolitical unification, after the creation of the necessary axes, and only then the Eurasian peoples and states will be able to solve their internal problems quite freely, without pressure from Atlanticist forces, which are fundamentally interested only in one thing, not to allow peace, harmony, prosperity, independence, dignity, and flourishing of tradition in Eurasia." End quote. What we have set up to this point serves as our preface to part 4 of this series. We felt it necessary to discuss the aforementioned points because it shows why there is a temptation for an alliance, if there is not already a covert alliance in place, between these factions associated with Alex Jones and Aleksandr Dugin, both of which identify a common globalist enemy. Now that we have prefaced part 4, let's jump in by going back to that January 26th, 2016 interview we covered in part 2, where Max Kaiser and his wife Stacy were on InfoWars live from Moscow. On that exact same program was former CIA caseworker and retired Marine Robert David Steele. Steele helped set up the Marine Corps' Marine Intelligence Activity with General Alfred Gray.
I'm a former Marine, as you know, and I created the Marine Corps Intelligence Center.
That group was a precursor to General James L. Jones's Marine Corps Intelligence Department. General Jones is someone we will discuss in part 5 of our series. What is hardly ever mentioned about Steele was his connection to Russian intelligence-run Russia International Affairs Council, where Steele was listed on their website with the title of Chief Enabling Officer. Russia International Affairs Council was partly established by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The former chairman of this board of trustees was Primakov, who we mentioned was deputy chairman of the KGB and head of its foreign intelligence, that is, First Directorate, under Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev. Russia International Affairs Council has over 100 prominent members of Russia's business, for example, Alpha Bank and Lukoil, the latter whose representatives were visiting Steve Bannon's Cambridge Analytica UK office, military, government, and scientific community. In addition to KGB FSB influence under the former chairman Primakov, Russia International Affairs Council also has Valentin Krelbennikov, who is a former director of the Russian military intelligence on its council, as well as Vyacheslav Trubnikov as vice president, who is former director of Russian Foreign Intelligence, or the SVR for short. Steele had access via Russian International Affairs Council to powerful Russian business people, government, and the highest levels of Russian intelligence community. Did he take advantage of that access? We don't know the answer to that question, and with his passing, it became less likely that we would. In the previously mentioned interview with Alex and Steele, both took a pro-Russia stance. Alex made a comment that people working on the F-35 program were responsible for sedition, treason, and sabotage, while Steele said that Russia is not our number one enemy, which is not surprising considering his associations.
Everything with,
Yes.
with the new Joint Strike Fighter that cost over $1 billion a piece and isn't even as good
Look.
as an F-15, they admit. I mean, isn't that sedition and treason and sabotage to build?
Guantanamo should be reserved for Lockheed Martin executives.
If you followed our series up to this point, we don't have to reinforce the point that Alex sought an alliance with Russia, but we include a short audio clip here for any new viewers confirming that point.
No, we should naturally be allied, but that's not what they want. They want to make Russia the number one enemy. They want.
Around the same time of Alex's first Dugin interview on InfoWars, December 20th, 2016, and second, February 7th, 2017 interview, we had what appears to be the Russian Allied Intelligence Community faction coming out and taking victory laps in speeches proclaiming a successful counter-coup or digital insurgency, and then praising of Putin for his restraint during this operation. The first to do so publicly in this group was Steve Pachinik, who we mentioned earlier in this series as being well connected to organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, RAND Corp, and the fact he was born to a Russian mother in Cuba and speaks Russian, as well as the fact that he worked under Henry Kissinger. We will now play a series of 4 clips. The first one is Pachinik's victory lap speech, where he discusses WikiLeaks. The second, a later statement by him placing emphasis on psychological warfare. The third is him claiming he helped place Putin in power. And finally, the last is Alex Jones suggesting, like in the first clip, he was briefed on WikiLeaks' operation before it was a known thing. Starting now with the first, which was dated November 1st, 2016.
I am just a small part of something far bigger than myself. It was the brave men and women who were in the FBI, the CIA, the Director of Intelligence, the military intelligence, and men and women in 15 other intelligence organizations who were sick and tired of seeing this corruption in the White House, in the Justice Department, and in the intelligence system. And we decided that there was something we had to do in order to save the Republic. So we initiated a counter-coup through Julian Assange, who's been very brave and really quite formidable in his ability to come forth and provide all the necessary emails that we gave to him in order to undermine Hillary and Bill Clinton. Again, America, we're going through a major, major transition and, quite frankly, a second American Revolution. We do not have guns, we do not have weapons, we do not intend to kill anybody, we do not intend to harm anybody. But we, the American public, and those of us who serve as veterans and in the intelligence service like myself, will stop the Clintons from assuming power that they don't deserve. At the same time, we will make certain that Obama leaves without any trail of a pardon or any other act of treason. In effect, we want a peaceful transition in this great American Republic. I bring you this news, and I want you to understand what has happened. A moment of history is occurring right now in front of us, and I'm proud to explain it to you. But I do say that the world has transformed from a kinetic force structure, that is military wars, to one where economic and psychological warfare become the predominant tools of a new generation. None of them served our military or served overseas in combat. And none have the experience of being able to read psychological profiles, implement regime change, and understand that Putin is as ruthless as the people who put him in, namely myself. Putin has no problem instigating a conflict that will start within a week and force the United States to come to the assistance of Zelensky in the Ukraine. We cannot allow that to happen.
Arrest me, and I was shown all the data transmissions, all the information. I was shown WikiLeaks, all of it, before it was even, they're going to subpoena.
The first clip is so important, part of it must be restated here. Pachinik said, "It was the brave men and women who were in the FBI, CIA, Director of Intelligence, Military Intelligence, and men and women in 15 other intelligence organizations. We decided that there was something that we had to do in order to save the Republic. So we initiated a counter-coup through Julian Assange, who has been very brave to come forth and provide all the necessary emails that we gave to him in order to undermine Hillary Clinton. We are going through a major transition and a second American Revolution. Now, this statement from Pachinik is quite interesting, to say the very least. He admits that his group was working with Assange. We will note again that our government says Russian intelligence unit Fancy Bear, through handle Guccifer 2.0, transferred the WikiLeaks emails to Assange. Yet here is Pachinik saying it was the U.S. intelligence community faction that was allied against Hillary Clinton that did the transfer. We wonder if Pachinik has ever been investigated by the FBI, or is he too well connected? It should be noted again that Alex Jones alluded that he was briefed on WikiLeaks before it was even a known thing, and both him and Pachinik are close associates. If our government is telling the truth about Assange, who we had pointed out in an earlier part of the series was associated with Russian intelligence compromised organizations, and associated with questionable individuals like Israel Shamir, who is a close Dugin associate, then we have what looks like Pachinik and Jones admitting to something that looks like cooperation with an organization working with Russian intelligence, or that they are even providing cover for Russian intelligence. These are potentially damning admissions, unless you subscribe to the theory of Alex Jones and his associates, that our Anglo-American establishment is so evil that we must ally with Russia to throw them off, and we are supposed to believe Russia will aid us in this. Next up on the victory lap of speeches after Pachinik was retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn speaking to the Young America's Foundation on November 14th, 2017. Flynn in that speech called the 2016 election of Trump a, quote, revolution and digital insurgency and irregular warfare at its finest.
This was not an election. This was a revolution. This was a revolution. And I have been doing this a bit for him. And we have an army, okay, as a soldier and as a general, as a retired general. We have an army of digital soldiers. What we are now, what we call, I call them, because this was an insurgency, folks. This was run like an insurgency. This was irregular warfare at its finest in politics. And that story will continue to be told here. But we have what we call citizen journalists. Okay? Because the journalists that we have in our media did a disservice to themselves, actually more than they did to this country. They did a disservice to themselves because they displayed an arrogance that is unprecedented. And so the American people decided to take over the idea of information. They took over the idea of information, and they did it through social media.
A large part of Flynn's irregular warfare strategy of his digital army was psychological operations. And he had a very capable lieutenant in his army who happened to be an actual Navy junior grade lieutenant and information dominance warfare officer with a security clearance named Jack Posobiec. Posobiec helped conduct the hashtag Pizzagate psychological operation, which was aimed at supporting Trump and hurting the Democrats, and it promoted a conspiracy theory about child sex slaves in the basement of a pizza shop in D.C. That psychological operation was so successful, perhaps too successful, that it led to a man going to Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria, where Posobiec had also been to do an expose earlier, with an AR-15 firing off rounds hoping to save non-existent child sex slaves from their tormentors. This psyop was similar to the one conducted by Coup and Robert David Steele and other InfoWars associates, which affected the psyop victim, Q Shaman, who was inside the Capitol on January 6th and was seen months earlier campaigning against secret pedophile bases of operation. One of the employees of the pizza shop filed a victim impact statement, blaming both Posobiec and InfoWars, both of which were undeniably helping conduct the psychological operation. The man that fired off the rounds was arrested, but the military-grade psychological operation carried out by current and former U.S. psychological operations officers, along with intelligence-connected InfoWars, faced zero consequences from what we can tell.
And I decided that I wanted to go for some pizza. And so I realized that there was a pizza place that I had heard about very, very nearby my home, Washington, D.C., called Comet Pizza. So, let's go take a look, shall we? Comet Pizza. Here we go.
Last up on the victory lap of election win speeches and coming back to Robert David Steele, he penned an article on January 9th, 2017, which appeared on Russian disinformation outlet globalresearch.ca. Global Research, according to the U.S. State Department, has ties to the Russian military intelligence, the Strategic Culture Foundation, which is tasked by Russia's foreign intelligence, as well as South Front, which is tasked by Russia's Federal Security Service, and a group Jack Posobiec just happened to retweet a lot of. Global Research was featured in the August 2020 State Department report on Russian disinformation. Steele's article was titled, "The Soft Coup Collapses, CIA Bluffing, Russia Did Not Hack, Blackmail Revealed, What Next?" Quoting Steele, "Russians did not hack the election. It is the beginning of the end of the deep state in the USA, question. Aided by enormous restraint on the part of Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, the soft coup in the USA has collapsed. Credit for the defeat of the soft coup has been earned by two persons in one group, Donald Trump, Michael Flynn, whose deep personal experience in the netherworld of black special operations and green clandestine and covert action operations informs him in a manner few can claim. The group has many members, but three stand out, William Binney, Ray McGovern, finally, Steve Pieczenik. Here Steele is praising Putin, Trump, Flynn, William Binney, who is a member of Justice for Julian, Ray McGovern, also a member of Justice for Julian, who was at the RT conference with Flynn, and lastly, Pieczenik. These were some of the intelligence community members working to get Trump elected in Flynn's digital insurgency and revolution involving military-grade psychological operations on the American people. Both psychological operations officers Flynn and Posobiec would go on to write books about psyops for their followers. Confirming Steele was deeply tied to Trump being in power, after Trump had left office and Biden came to power, Steele was threatening flag officers that they needed to use the military to reinstate Trump. This was on a program with QAnon media influencer Nino Rodriguez, who now appears as a guest on Steve Bannon's War Room, where Posobiec is also a frequent guest.
Boom, we are recording. I'm here with Robert David Steele once again on ninoscorner.tv, and I'm probably going to put this on my YouTube unless we say some shit that's just, they can bomb my channel.
BitChute. YouTube turns into empty gray boxes and broken links.
So, Robert, you sent an email today to me that I was like, wow, I read it. And what really got my attention was General McInerney.
Got a note on Peter Navarro's new book, and Peter really highlighted what happened in that last part of the election. I know General McInerney and I were working on encouraging martial law then because there were so many things to do it.
Major disagreements to come within the military leadership. Stay tuned. Joe Biden is not president. Hello. That's huge. But what scares me a little bit is the major disagreements to come within the military leadership. That means it looks to me like shit's about to hit the fan.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things I was doing, and Juan Savin and others are doing it also, is roughly 1/3 of the flag officers are being chicken shits. And they are blocking the other 2/3 of the flag officers who are saying, hey, it's clear. Not only do all Americans know that the election was stolen, but all foreign leaders do too. Nobody wants to waste time on Biden and Harris and Pelosi and Schumer.
Right. So what has to happen? So what's going to happen? So those flag officers that are blocking everybody else, how do you get them to understand?
I don't know. Look, I'm not a flag officer. I'm not in their circle, but I certainly know. I know over 70 flag officers, including Mike Flynn. I think Charlie Flynn is going to be the next chief of staff of the Army after he comes back from the Pacific. There's no question but that the Army, the Marine Corps, Special Operations are in the president's corner. The Space Force, and when I say president, I mean President Donald Trump. The Space Force is in the president's corner, and I think at least half of the Navy is. Just like when I did the movie with Joe Flynn as Mike Flynn's surrogate, and I said, make the deal, motherfucker, you're going to die. I am now sending a message that comes from higher authority. if these guys don't step up and defend the Constitution in the next 30 to 45 days, they are going to see the Pentagon demolished, torn to the ground, salt blown into that ground, and all of them will be busted to colonel, lose their top secret clearances, and never again work in the military-industrial complex. That's the deal.
The same month that Steele penned his article and that Trump was elected, Dugin's European associate, Daniel Freeberg, set up altright.com. Freeberg owns Arctos Media, which publishes Dugin's books. Interestingly, Dugin, during the early 1990s, founded his own publishing house, Arctogaea. That word combines the Greek words Arctos and Gaea to form Northland. This suggests Dugin inspired Freeberg's media company. Both Dugin and Richard Spencer would write for altright.com. Spencer is on the board of the company, and his ex-wife, who identifies as Russian as well as Eurasian, translated Dugin's books into English and wrote for the Journal of Eurasian Affairs, which Dugin is on the advisory board for. Spencer is connected to Dugin, Freeberg, Baked Alaska, Jack Posobiec, Alex Jones, Matthew Heimbach, and David Duke, among others. This is worth mentioning because we can see in early 2017 definite Russian influence in the alt-right community, which was a strategy mentioned by Dugin in his textbook for the Russian Military Academy. All the previously mentioned individuals have connections into Russia, either first or second degree. Shortly after altright.com was set up, Dugin came on Alex's InfoWars, marking the third time he did an interview with an InfoWars associate. On February 7, 2017, Alex again signaled, with his introduction to Dugin, that they were fighting for a multipolar world, and Trump was part of that fight against the shared enemy both Dugin and Alex have identified as the globalist, which means the Anglo-American establishment, and more specifically the Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg, Club of Rome, etc. Jones went on to discuss Joseph McCarthy and how he supposedly found a group that was sitting above the Soviets and communists, that was controlling both sides, and that the Russians were not our enemy. Alex would argue that this group sitting above the Soviets are the globalists. He said Trump was briefed on all this through people like Roy Cohn.
Joseph McCarthy. And McCarthy finally went, it's not the Russians. There's an evil global group manipulating both sides. We've got to stop it. And that's when they shut him down. Trump was given all that info when he was like 25 years old. You can actually dig and find New York Times articles about it, about Roy Cohn and all the rest of it. So Trump's got the big picture. So when he was told all this by top generals, they asked him to run a year before the election. They said, sir, you're the man. We know you know all this. And he did it. He did it and he won. This was a military and intelligence coup with the American people. The revolution here was American. How dare the media act like we couldn't do this ourselves and the Russians did it? Of course the Russians cheered it on as they watched the globalists in Europe, the Vatican, the Saudi Arabians, the communist Chinese, not the Chinese people, but their leadership, all gang up on us and try to stop us getting free like Russia did. But here's the difference. Putin took him a decade to get Russia quasi-free. Trump has been in 17 days, and they're already trying to kill him.
Cohn was Senator Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel during the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954, and also an associate of Roger Stone. And it was Cohn that had originally introduced Stone to Trump. Cohn, it turned out, was actually a closeted homosexual who died from AIDS and contradicted his own nature by advocating that homosexuals get banned from government posts. Being a homosexual back during Cohn's time was dangerous for many reasons, including blackmail, which is why, along with him turning on his own kind, we would not trust what Cohn had to say, considering he would be a top target for Soviet intelligence to blackmail. Dugin's next interview on InfoWars would come days before Charlottesville. Before that event, people like Jack Posobiec, Baked Alaska, Aleksandr Dugin, Richard Spencer, Matthew Heimbach, Eric Stryker, David Duke, Alex Jones, Paul Joseph Watson of InfoWars, and Nick Fuentes were all either first-degree or second-degree connections to one another. Fuentes, Spencer, Duke, Heimbach, Baked Alaska, and Eric Stryker were all physically at the event. Sometime around April 22nd, 2017, it appears as if Flynn's digital soldier lieutenant, that is Jack Posobiec, got word that he would be on the InfoWars program following Dugin on August 4th, 2017. In what seems to be the only instance we've found, Posobiec was doing his information dominance officer position with the U.S. Navy Justice when he posted on his Twitter an image of Dugin's Foundations of Geopolitics 1997, saying, Putin has all the Russian officers read this book by Dugin. He then went on to acknowledge that Dugin said in the book, Ukraine should be annexed by Russia. It should be noted that Posobiec took an oath in 2013 to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign or domestic, when he was promoted and sworn in as an information dominance warfare officer in the United States Navy. Someone in this position would know how to do some basic open source intelligence gathering and realize Dugin was likely a KGB SVR asset coming from a military intelligence family, supported the coup to prevent the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and advocated for the destabilization of the United States in his military academy textbook, and was sanctioned in 2015 by the U.S. government. Posobiec, with that gold information dominance officer's pin on his breast, would be expected to know this at bare minimum. 52 days passed since his first post about Dugin, and Posobiec again posted an image of Dugin's book. This time, however, he was holding Dugin's book inside the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters, saying it was summer campaign reading. By this point, Posobiec had ample time to do basic intelligence assessment of Dugin. We have put together a sample 2-page intelligence report on Dugin that could easily have been done by an 8th grader, showing what Posobiec should have known and should have warned everyone about. Posobiec would, another 52 days later, in what appears to be his first appearance on InfoWars, according to PrisonPlanet.tv's archives returning search results for Posobiec, come on the InfoWars after Dugin's appearance, and despite having 104 days to understand Dugin, as a U.S. intelligence officer, active or retired, should, Posobiec failed to warn the InfoWars audience about Dugin. We consider this potentially a failure to uphold his oath to support and defend the Constitution against foreign enemies in an information war for the minds of the American people. The average busy American doesn't know any better, but an information dominance warfare officer in the U.S. Navy should. Most U.S. citizens are not equipped to deal with military-grade disinformation targeting them, and we need people like Posobiec to protect Americans, and when they fail to do so, as some U.S. generals have pointed out, there is no safeguard left between the minds of Americans and the psychological attack of foreign enemies. It should be noted that Posobiec would marry Tanya Tay Posobiec, who was born in the USSR, in an Eastern Orthodox wedding. Her father appears to serve in the internal police force of Belarus. Belarus is allied to Russia. Also, Posobiec is an associate of Baked Alaska, who has adopted family from Russia and has visited Russia over a dozen times. Posobiec was also an associate of Spencer. Additionally, Posobiec was an associate of Cassandra Fairbanks, who worked for Russian state-owned Sputnik News. So there is reason to believe Posobiec chose not to warn Americans listening to InfoWars that day about Dugin because of his connections and bias towards Russia. It also appears that Posobiec might have been recruited by InfoWars in some fashion. How else do we explain his reading of Dugin's book and his first appearance on InfoWars coinciding with Dugin's appearance and his failure to warn the audience about Dugin? We don't know what the real story is and only have limited information to go off of, but these are questions that come to mind with the information that we do have, and they are deadly serious questions.
Back and let our guest speak because he speaks English. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on. Let's spend a few minutes just on you, what you really stand for, what you really believe, the big movements you've launched that admittedly have reinvigorated Russia and given it faith again in yourselves. The globalists want to suck that out of all of us. And then let's get into who you think Putin really is, who you think Trump is in this new multipolar world.
I'm traditionalist, I am Christian, and I didn't accept this kind of values. I'm anti-communist.
Sure, as I've actually read your writing. You'll explore each avenue of those and then show the problems of how they're all basically failed systems, centralized. We have to go back to our primal natures, basically. I just know this. Trump wants justice, and he doesn't want wars with countries that aren't getting in our business and attacking us. And he can see the real world and see that an alliance with Russia and with European countries and with the UK and with Japan and others against some of the other countries that are trying to expand and actually threatening people's the way to go, instead of globalists using America as a tool of world domination. That's why they're so mad at Trump.
But I hate the globalist agenda. And
sure, if America's been conquered by globalists, which we're starting to try to stop, then you have to rally your people through nationalism to defend yourselves.
Yes, so now we understand, everybody in Russia, now we understand that America was hijacked by a globalist sect, and Trump is restoring American dignity. And we stop immediately to hate America, immediately, because that wasn't America that we hated before. It was globalist elite. And now we see that half and more, the majority of American population, as well as against this globalist sect. And that makes globalism the problem of each country, each people. We are as well under attack of globalists, as well as you. And we need to be united, concerning our differences. And I think that real The real multipolarity could lead to cooperation, to the friendship between different countries and different people.
Revolts didn't start with Trump. It started in our military, in our Christian military, not wanting to openly back al-Qaeda and ISIS. So that's the fissure. And then we started working with Russia. We first reported it 4.5 years ago. People didn't believe it. Now it's mainstream news. And so General Flynn and others are saying Russia wants to work with us. They're not a threat. Let's destroy the EU. It's unelected. It's evil. Let's free Europe. Let's have a bunch of trade. Let's get China under control. And let's actually have real peace.
Putin really has helped Trump, showing the example how to defend the realist values, how to defend.
Exactly. The way he did it was by leadership and openly putting the ideas out like you've done and I've done. And our ideas defeat globalism because it's about being soulless. And if we just stand up, they can't beat us. So Russia is the example of pulling out of globalism first. And I salute you for that. And now all over the world, from Brexit to Italy to everywhere to Iceland, everybody's pulling out. And they keep saying, Russia did it, Russia did it. It's not true that Russia manipulated it, but Russia did lead by example. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to point something out. I'm not in an intelligence agency. I organically built InfoWars and, you know, did this just off of Americana and the listeners supporting us. But obviously over the years as we've grown, I mean, we know generals and colonels and CIA people and a lot of famous folks, a lot of undercover people. But let me just tell you, almost the entire CIA, NSA, the branches of the military know what happened to Russia. They now know about all the secret documents of how the globalists, the proto-globalists sent over to take over Russia, who was not expansionist, to use Russia as this engine to take over, how that stalled and failed, how Russia's reconstituting. They've got a few people in intelligence agencies that still want to have war with Russia. They believe that's the global domination model and that, you know, they need to prove that Trump's not a Russian, you know, agent by going after Russia.
Alex's third interview with Dugin on August 4th, 2017, was mostly more of the same from the previous. However, this time he had Dugin's book, The Fourth Political Theory, on his desk and indicated to his audience the importance of Dugin by inviting Dugin back on a monthly basis to discuss his book, among other things.
Now, going back to our guest, and I want to invite him back up on a monthly basis if you'd like to join us, Aleksandr Dugin, advisor to President Putin.
It should be noted that the Fourth Political Theory calls for the destruction of the American empire. We would assume Alex is aware of this, and he expects us to assume the globalist or the Anglo-American establishment should be destroyed, and we shouldn't question cui bono, or who fills the power vacuum on the geopolitical chessboard. Or if we do question it, he expects us to assume it would be a libertarian, non-interventionist American great space, coexisting with other great spaces in a more balanced, less enslaved multipolar world order, perhaps. Even if Alex genuinely believes what he says, would it not be a huge risk to trust your fate allying with Dugin and Russia, expecting their foreign elites to do what they say regarding establishing great spaces and multipolarity after defeating the Anglo-American establishment? Days later that same month, Charlottesville exploded. Given Dugin's proximity to many of the influencers there, we cannot ignore what he said in 1997, which we have previously quoted. Quoting again from Dugin's Foundations of Geopolitics, "It is necessary to counteract U.S. Atlanticist geopolitics at all levels and in all regions of the world, trying to weaken, demoralize, deceive, and ultimately defeat the enemy as much as possible. It is especially important to bring geopolitical turmoil into the U.S. domestic reality by encouraging all kinds of separatism, various ethnic, social, and racial conflicts, actively supporting all dissident movements of extremist, racist, sectarian groups that destabilize internal political processes in the USA. At the same time, it makes sense to support isolationist tendencies in U.S. politics, the thesis of those often right-wing Republican circles that believe that the U.S. should confine itself to domestic problems." End quote. Nick Fuentes, Richard Spencer, David Duke, Matthew Heimbach, Baked Alaska, and Eric Stryker were all in attendance at Charlottesville. Days after Charlottesville, Dugin wrote, "Liberals are absolute evil, and the war against them is sacred war, our war. Here we are on the war side. Charlottesville is the beginning of the war. Let it be our war." The son of a 3-star Russian military intelligence general and likely Russian intelligence asset was telling Americans Charlottesville was our war. It is hard to think that Charlottesville was not part of the destabilization operation Dugin previously advised the high-level officers at the Russian General Staff Academy to carry out against Americans. It would be done primarily through information operations and psychological operations, distorting Americans' perceptions and thereby hijacking their realities, allowing Russia to control Americans' decision-making processes. It's part of Russia's next-generation warfare doctrine of information confrontation, also known as NGW-IPB. Shortly after Charlottesville, it was reported that Posobiec had his security clearance suspended. Alex, despite inviting Dugin back for regularly monthly appearances, probably had someone tell him things were heating up too much in his admitted information war.
Supporting our information warfare operation against the globalists.
That was now turning kinetic, and he should distance himself from Dugin. How else do we explain Alex inviting Dugin back on a monthly basis?
Now, going back to our guest, and I want to invite him back up on a monthly basis if he'd like to join us, Aleksandr Dugin, advisor to President Putin.
Then never again publicly speaking with him. Steve Bannon would go on to secretly meet with Dugin in Rome in 2018 and proposed an alliance of sorts with Russia, according to the book War for Eternity. Alex had pushed Dugin off to one of his other hosts, and he came back on InfoWars one last time on October 25th, 2017, via David Knight, as if to fade Dugin out like he wasn't interesting anymore and cover up the fact that he basically launched a small war in America with Alex Jones. Perhaps that is stretching things a bit, but we will let the audience make up their mind. While Dugin's connection to InfoWars was fading out, Alex was applying for a Russian business visa, which he acquired in early 2018 that was good past January 6, 2021. Admittedly, and again this might be a stretch, but perhaps Alex was acquiring a visa in case he needed to leave the country to friendly territory. Assange was in exile, and yet Jones' guest Steve Pieczenik openly talked about working with Assange via his group of intelligence community members. Both Pieczenik and Alex openly talked about a digital coup with the intelligence community. Now that things were turning kinetic with Jones and Dugin's associates, an exit strategy might be wise if the pendulum started swinging the other way, and InfoWars' connections and favors from factions inside the FBI, CIA, DIA, and SOCOM started disconnecting and drying up. Or maybe Alex was going to Russia for business like he had publicly stated. Maybe he never feared he would have to leave the country because all he was doing was conducting free speech in a free country. What we do know is that 6 VIPs at Charlottesville were connected to Dugin, Jones, and Russia, either in the first or second degrees, and we will close out part 4 of this series discussing those connections in detail, starting with Nick Fuentes. Fuentes appeared with Alex over a dozen times since 2017. He has been a guest on RT, proudly donned the Russian military flag on his program, as well as when he was on RT, along with a Russia-US flag lapel pin, and he has put out videos titled Why We Support Russia, and If You Don't Support Russia in This Conflict, You Are Dumb. Fuentes has also gone on to interview Iranian intelligence recruiting event, per the U.S. Department of Justice, New Horizon attendee E. Michael Jones, who is an associate of Dugin via that event, and also associate of Philip Giraldi and Michael Maloof, also via the New Horizon event. Giraldi is an editor of the UNS Review, which Eric Stryker writes for, and Maloof is an associate of retired General Boykin, who both Jones and Pieczenik named as being helpful in the coup. Fuentes is also an associate of Baked Alaska, who has adopted family from Russia and went there a dozen or so times. Fuentes is also connected to Milo Yiannopoulos, Ali Alexander, Jay Dyer, and Tim Pool's brother. The Milo connection puts him second degree to Flynn, whom Flynn praised during his Digital Soldier speech.
For the young audience here, for the young ones here, and I mentioned it to a couple of guys, also with Milo Yiannopoulos. Okay? So, see, a lot of people in here won't know who he is. I tag him on Twitter, because he's a phenomenal individual, and for...
Lastly, Fuentes has floated the idea of a Eurasian Union to his viewers, which is what Dugin advocates.
It's not the worst thing in the world if another country becomes more powerful than America. It's not the worst thing in the world if Russia becomes more powerful than America. I don't think that'll happen anytime soon. But if China and Russia team up, or if some other coalition teams up, if there is some collection of countries that can exert influence in the other direction, wouldn't that be a good thing? Wouldn't it be a good thing if we had people talking about our civil rights in their country like we're talking about the civil rights of Cubans in ours? Wouldn't it be great if Poland or Italy or Hungary, or what if there was a right-wing European Union? What if there was a Eurasian coalition led by Russia that had an open technology fund which would support freedom of speech in America? What if China made a censorship-proof social media for Americans?
Richard Spencer is an associate of Dugin, Freeberg, Jones, Duke, Posobiec, Baked Alaska, Cassandra Fairbanks, who's a former Sputnik employee, and Heimbach. Spencer probably met with Dugin at one point, given his first-degree connection to Freeberg, who is a first degree to Dugin. Dugin promoted Spencer multiple times, as well as Spencer promoting Dugin, and we find tweets of Dugin specifically promoting Spencer's alt-right material, which Dugin seeks to be the architect of, that is the alt-right. Spencer was also a contributor to Dugin's sanctioned Geopolitica.ru, which calls for, on its landing page, to destroy Carthage, that is the United States. Spencer sits on the board of altright.com, co-founded by Freeberg, who we mentioned is an associate of Dugin, and his Arctis Media publishes Dugin. His ex-wife, Nina, who identifies as Russian and Eurasian, was a translator for Dugin and wrote for the Eurasian Journal, where Dugin sits on the advisory board. That journal is issued by Dugin's International Eurasia Movement, where Dugin associate Tiberio Graziani sits on the Supreme Council. Graziani was also director of the Italian Journal of Geopolitics, where GlobalResearches.ca's founder, Michael Chosudowski, sat on the scientific committee. We also pointed out GlobalResearch.ca collaborates with Russia's GRU, FSB, and SVR that both InfoWars and Jack Posobiec have links to. That is InfoWars to SVR and Posobiec to FSB, as well as InfoWars Associates connections to GlobalResearch.ca and Katahan. Spencer has been a guest of Alex Jones on InfoWars. He has been pictured in photos with Baked Alaska, who has Russian family ties, and whose arm was signed by the president. Spencer was also in a photo with Posobiec at a bar in Cleveland, and they have mutual connections, such as neo-Nazi Clark brothers, who were associated with the killer who perpetrated the massacre at the Pittsburgh Synagogue in 2018. One of those brothers committed suicide, and the other was arrested on a gun charge. Spencer is seen in a photo with them outside the White House, and Posobiec is seen with them in a suburb, holding a microphone while the two brothers follow him, one with a film camera. Next is David Duke, who is an associate of Dugin, Jones, Stryker, and Spencer. He has traveled and lived in Russia and Ukraine for almost 7 years of his life. He was also interviewed by RT and Eric Stryker on Russia Insider. Duke appeared as a guest on InfoWars back in August 2015, and on that same program, that same day, Alex was interviewing New Horizon attendee and Dugin Boykin McInerney associate, Michael Maloof. Next up is Heimbach. He is an associate of Spencer and Dugin. Dugin delivered a recorded speech to Heimbach in 2015 at the founding of his Traditionalist Workers' Party, which uses Dugin's 8-point chaos symbol cut in half horizontally, so only the top half remains, a not-so-subtle attempt to distance the connection between the two. Heimbach also appeared as a guest on RT and previously told Al Jazeera that, quote, Russia is our most powerful ally, end quote. Heimbach can be seen in photos holding Dugin's Fourth Political Theory, the same book Alex Jones was holding on his broadcast, and the same book Steve Bannon told Benjamin Teitelbaum he was a fan of. Heimbach was reportedly kicked out of the National Socialist Movement for being a communist. He has appeared on RT and is in photos supporting Russia, for example, with a sign saying, Russians are our Christian brothers, with Dugin's chaos symbol next to it, and the Orthodox symbol. Next is Baked Alaska. He is an associate of Spencer, Fuentes, and Posobiec. He has 5 family members adopted from Russia. His family runs a nonprofit helping Russians with medical supplies. He has been to Russia over a dozen times, and he speaks some Russian. He has promoted Brittany Pettibone on Twitter, who is an associate of Lauren Southern. Both Southern and Pettibone went to Russia to interview Dugin. Southern has also been a guest on Alex Jones's InfoWars. Eric Stryker is associated with the Traditionalist Workers' Party, having been in a shield formation with them in Charlottesville. He writes for UN's Review, where Giraldi is an editor. He was a Dugin associate and fellow attendee of the Iranian intelligence recruiting event, New Horizon. Stryker also writes for Russia Insider, which republishes Russian foreign intelligence-directed SCF articles, as well as alleged Russian foreign intelligence-run Zero Hedge articles. Charles Bossman, the founder of Russia Insider, has previously asked Putin oligarch and Dugin associate Konstantin Malafy for money. He was at the 2015 RT event with Flynn, he was in studio with Alex Jones in 2019, and he was inside the Capitol building on January 6, consequently leaving the country for Russia to potentially avoid jail time. Stryker has also interviewed David Duke, and he praised Julian Assange. It should be clear now to our audience that there is an undeniable connection between these 6 Charlottesville VIPs to Dugin, Jones, and Russia. What still might be up for interpretation is whether or not this is a coincidence. It is our opinion at this point, with all the information presented from part 1 of our series to now, that it is not a coincidence, and there is evidence to suggest that Charlottesville is a Russian destabilization operation foreshadowing January 6th, and carried out by information operations and psychological warfare against the American people. We understand this might be too much of a stretch for some, and Part 5 and Part 6 of our series will continue to build on what we have presented here so far.